Welcome to FOXSOUL's Black Report. This is a space where we bring you Black America's headline news, views, and opinions. I'm Romeo.
Hey there, I'm Brooke Thomas.
I'm Demi.
Peace and love. I'm Nielle.
On today's report, Republicans have blocked voting rights legislation again. So we have Professor and political commentator Dr. Wendy Osefo here to break it down for you and discuss specifically how it affects you, Black Americans.
We talk venture capital equity for people of color with Dylan Ewu and Taj Eldridge. Plus, news on the NFL, as well as Serena Williams and Michael B. Jordan. They invest in HBCU students as well as alumni.
Soulmates, we have that and so much more. You know why? Because it's our voice and it's our truth. So let's talk about it.
Soulmates, thank you for joining us. Senate Republicans have blocked Democrats from advancing a revised bill to overhaul federal elections. This marks the latest blow to hopes of getting voting legislation to President Biden. The Senate voted 49 to 51, and I'll explain that, to end debate on whether to bring up the bill that's known as the Freedom to Vote Act, falling short of the 60 needed. As The Hill reports, the bill would make Election Day a national holiday, set national minimum standards for early voting and voting by mail, and include standards for states requiring a voter identification. It also has new requirements on disclosing who is behind online ads and aims to stop partisan gerrymandering. The reason the vote was 49 to 51 is because Senator Chuck Schumer actually changed his vote to no to get the numbers so they can bring it back up again.
Here to discuss yesterday's vote is political commentator, John Hopkins professor, and one of my favorite and realest housewives of Potomac. Welcome, Dr. Wendy Osefo. Okay, I think your mic is off.
No.
Okay.
I'm not muted.
Now I hear you. Okay, so Dr. Wendy, I wanted to talk to you today, this morning. Vice President Kamala Harris, as well as Joe Biden, they were in front of the Dr. King Monument, talking about his legacy on the 10th anniversary of that monument being resurrected. What are your thoughts about the White House and their response to voting rights when so many Black advocates are asking them to push the filibuster and to do more, and they're just not? What are your thoughts on the White House's stand on voting rights?
I believe that this moment, as we are witnessing it, is a watershed moment for the White House. They have to really decide what is going to be the marquee of this presidential administration. By that, I mean, when you look at every presidential administration, they have a legislation that stands as the benchmark for what they were able to put out during their 4 years. And so right now, the White House has to decide whether voting rights will be that. You see a lot of Black voices being raised because when it was time for election, Biden said that voting rights was at the forefront for him and his administration if he was to be elected. So now Black leaders are holding his feet to the fire and saying, what are you going to do? Now that you see how the Republicans are reacting to this, what is the White House going to do to ensure that all individuals have equity when it comes to voting rights?
Dr. Osefo, we are so excited to have you back here and be able to share your perspective with our soulmates. I want to ask you, after so many concessions and so much talk about this is what we need to do, this is what can work, do you think there was ever any reality in the idea that Senator Joe Manchin could sway Republicans?
If we look at Joe Manchin's history, we can see that that may not be something that he'll necessarily even want to do. Right now, this is going to go down party lines. Voting rights has always been historically separatist when it comes to Democrats and Republicans. And we are coming up on midterms, and everyone wants to keep their seat. So with something that could potentially bifurcate, the United States Congress, the House of Representatives, something like voting rights, people are going to teeter on the side of policy lines and political party lines. So Manchin being able to sway the Republicans, I don't see that something that's going to happen.
Wendy, it is always a pleasure to have you back on our show. Every time, a pleasure indeed. So I want to know your thoughts on the filibuster. Do you think it's time?
If it's not time now, then my question is, when is it time? We have to start asking ourselves, how are we going to proceed to make sure that this voting rights bill is enacted? If we can be quite clear, let's not mince words here. When we look at this bill, This bill is trying to eradicate voter suppression. These guardrails that are put in place within this bill is particularly to help, yes, all Americans, but in particular, Black and Brown Americans who have been systematically impacted by voter suppression laws in different states. So whether or not the filibuster is enacted, you have to look at what's at stake here. And what's at stake is the midterms that are coming up. What's at stake here is also the presidential election that is going to be coming up. So whether or not the White House takes action on this voting rights bill will be a snowball effect of all future elections to come.
Doctor, I totally agree with you. And we're talking about the midterms coming up. The voting bills that don't move forward, how much of an impact is that going to have on the midterm? What do you think?
Is going to have a big impact. When we look at the last presidential election, we saw so many pockets of voter suppression throughout this country. We saw so many conversations around voter ID laws. We saw individuals who said that they mailed in their ballots, but their ballots were not accounted for. This particular bill addresses those issues. So whether or not this bill is able to be enacted will have a direct impact on the midterm elections. And let me be clear, there's a lot at stake here. Sometimes people only focus on what happens at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. The truth of the matter is what really impacts your life on a daily basis are those local elections. So if this voter registration bill does not pass, it is going to impact everyday Americans when it's time for us to reelect our senators, our House of Representatives, and other local officials. So this bill is tantamount, to say the least.
Thank you so much for joining us today and sharing this important perspective that you brought. And we look forward to having you back, Dr. Wendy.
Thank you so much for having me.
So senior White House officials spoke with families of African Americans slain by police last week. Multiple sources familiar with the discussion confirmed to CBS News. That included representatives for the family of George Floyd, according to two attendees. A White House officials say the focus of the discussion was to gather their input and priorities on executive actions the administration could take on police reform. The House passed the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act in March 2021, but congressional negotiations on bipartisan legislation broke down in the Senate nearly a month ago. President Biden recently told law enforcement members during the National Peace Officers Memorial Service at the Capitol, "We haven't gotten there yet, but we must get there." So I have so much that I feel about this because I feel first thing, it was a virtual discussion. I feel like it's kind of rude to have these families have to answer over and over and over, because honestly, it's great to be able to say I talked with the Biden administration, but what makes this conversation that you have to say over and over and over again different from we were talking to reporters or talking to the average person on the street? If there are going to be any solid, I feel like if I were the families, because one of the families, they were saying that half of the families were giving recommendations, half of the other families that were talking were just like, what is the point here? What am I doing? What are going to be the answers? I personally feel like there's so many recommendations that people have given. They're everywhere. The recommendations are everywhere. You can call up whoever. Someone can give you a recommendation of what can happen. I feel like when you call these families, you should call them with an action plan versus just calling them on a virtual line and telling the same story that you talk over and over again. And I thought it was really rude too that a White House official said that Joe Biden he's really committed to taking additional steps. Find those additional steps, then call the families, because I feel like it's not good to the healing process for me to have to tell the story over and over again, and the recommendations are already out in the world.
Yeah, Demi, I agree with you on that, because at the end of the day, these families have dealt with something that's very, very devastating, and they can't take that away. They want answers. They want results. They want to know. We want to know that black men and women can be protected. Unfortunately, we see what happens time and time again with certain police officers, not all of them, and then we see what happens to people who want to take the community and take matters into their own hands and stake Ahmaud Arbery. We see what's going on with that. So at the end of the day, if you want to sit down and have a conversation with us as business, those that have been through it, what answers do you have? What are you going to do to protect those moving forward?
I mean, I think the question that a lot of people have right now, picking up on what both of you just said, is that this is another conversation. And it is important. I think we all agree, right, to have conversations with people who matter and people who need to feel like they matter. But all of these people, it seems, have been saying that you have to hop over the hurdle of the bipartisanship in Congress. And there seems to be only one real way to do that, and that's not happening. So what else, you know what I mean? What else do you do? Is it just going to be just conversations, important conversations?
Right. But that word is filibuster. And if the Biden administration and the powers that be, if they were to enact or even like lower the threshold. So right now you need 10, right? You need 10, at least 10 from the other side to get things pushed through. Even if you lowered the threshold to 5, it might make it easier, or just get rid of it. And that's what it's all boiling down to. That's what Black advocates are pushing for Biden to get rid of the filibuster. And that would help voting rights, and that would help the Justice for George Floyd Policing Act go through.
It would definitely help those things. But at the end of the day, we worry that he hasn't got rid of the filibuster, because is it going to turn around and bite the Democrats in the back? And later on down the line, like if they get rid of it, will they pay that price later? But do we worry about that?
Well, what's so funny is, not even funny, but there's a conversation happening. And so there's this idea that, so, hey, if we're in the same position, if things are flipped down the line, we wouldn't want the filibuster to be gone. The question the statement that it seems many people have based on what they've seen the past, 12 years, is that if you are in a flipped position, the Republicans will end the filibuster.
Right.
And that's their behavior the past 12 years has made it clear that given the opportunity, starting the conversation, they will do everything that you're saying you're afraid to come out on the other end of. And so that's the question. You see Senator Manchin and Senator Sinema saying, if we end the filibuster, they'll just wipe out everything that we do. And you have a lot of progressives saying, if you end the filibuster, they'll never be in power again to wipe out what you do. And if you don't end the filibuster, then you'll likely never end up in power again, and you won't have to worry about it.
And to your point, Brooke, you're absolutely right. And this is not a golden rule. The filibuster has been changed throughout the course of Congress. So this wouldn't be the first, second, third, or last time that this happens. It's just all about politics. And right now, if you have the power or a little bit of the power, then why don't you go full throttle and make it happen for all of the policy and legislation that the Republicans are holding up? Just make it happen. And then if it has to change, it has to change. But get your agenda done now, because the 2022 midterms are coming up, and then we're rolling around with the presidential election. So let's get this policy pushed, so at least it looks like the Democrats are moving their agenda forward. And right now, it's not happening.
I think most of our soulmates would agree with you. All right, federal prosecutor in Kansas have launched a criminal grand jury investigation to a retired Kansas City police detective who is alleged to have exploited and terrorized Black residents of the city's North End for decades, according to CNN. Roger Golubsky is accused of being a dirty cop who used the power of his badge to exploit vulnerable Black women, including Black women who worked as prostitutes, according to a 2019 civil complaint filed by a man exonerated of double murder charges investigated by Golubsky. He was also accused of being on the payroll of a local drug kingpin and of framing people for crimes they did not commit. Golubsky's activities have been talked about throughout the surrounding Black communities in the area for decades, and recently came to the attention of hip-hop mogul and activist Jay-Z. The Reasonable Doubt MC and his social justice-oriented group Team Rock took out a full-page ad in the Washington Post last week, calling the alleged police corruption in Kansas City one of the worst examples of abuse of power in U.S. history. And I think we would agree with that, soulmates. If you know the story, this man's been doing this for decades, and this is what we're talking about. Unfortunately, there are cops out there like this, right? And these are things that are going to come forward. Imagine the things that we never even knew about, right? People's lives are changed forever due to cops. Bad cops is what I'm going to say, because they're either put behind bars for something they didn't do, where they got framed, right? Think of these Black women that were exploited by this man. What is that going to do for them mentally for the rest of their lives? And even though justice may eventually come in this situation, does it make things better for them at all?
I feel like if this man is found guilty of everything, he is a sick man. Lots of things, Romeo, like you said, exploiting Black women. There was one case where he exploited one man, did not live. He exploited his mother. Also, this man has invoked his Fifth Amendment rights more than 500 times in different civil depositions. So they need to do a lot of digging. Activists in this case are hoping that this investigation into him is pretty much going to be a snowball effect and create a bigger conversation, which I'm hoping happens, because this man has done a lot of dirt that hopefully it comes to light.
Yeah.
And I really appreciate the work that Team Rock is doing. They are amplifying stories across this nation. When we look at prison reform, when we look at law enforcement reform, they are really amplifying. So this happened in Kansas, but by placing that ad in the Washington Post, it made it a national headline. And so this is what we talk about when artists and mix art, and it's art and activism. It really amplifies conversations that are impacting Black and brown communities, and I just think that they're doing a great job of that.
I agree. Jay-Z, Team Rock, and you know, they don't do it for the headlines. They do it because they're saying enough is enough, and they're looking out for us.
Let's move on to our next story out of New York, actually. So the New York City Board of Health has officially declared racism a public health crisis, and the board is issuing guidelines to achieve what they're calling a more racially just recovery from the coronavirus pandemic. The board's chair says the move was made to build a healthier New York City, saying we must confront racism as a public health crisis, adding the COVID-19 pandemic magnified inequalities, leading to suffering disproportionately borne by communities of color in our city and across the nation, ending with the inequities of health along racial lines are not inevitable, and the resolution adopted is meant to recognize this crisis and demand action. And so, you know, obviously this is something that we've talked about on a national level. This is something even the CDC has talked about, right? Specifically COVID-19, because they're pointing out that the disparities, right, the inequities, it has been glaring for so many people, right? So many things that have been being said, it has been glaring for so many people, and it takes us back to DC again. But the fact of the matter is nearly every single person since June who has died of COVID-19 in Chocolate City has been Black. That is terrifying. And that's, I think, an important example. I know I'm going from New York down to DC, but the fact of the matter is that should horrify everyone. Right. You know what I mean? The numbers that we're seeing everywhere, who's in the hospital, who's not vaccinated, and obviously there are multiple reasons why people are not vaccinated, why people don't feel like they have the education that they should, what people are afraid of. But those numbers are terrifying.
They definitely are.
It's terrifying. And this is what we talk about when we talk about systemic racism, and how it's not just about criminal justice reform and law enforcement. It has to do with education, and it has to do with health. And what makes this so important is that it sets up the conversation in city council and state legislators to have policy shifts and really address this situation from a policy piece versus a conversation piece. So yeah, we talk about it here on the Black Report, but when you have somebody like this in a position of power to say that racism is attached to it, you open the door for policy to change, and that's where the change and shift is going to come when we talk about systemic racism.
Absolutely. Yeah, we definitely need that to happen, right? And just the other day, a longtime friend of mine lost his life, unfortunately, to COVID-19. So even though the numbers continue to go down across the country, we still have to be aware and make sure we take care of ourselves and our families. Another unfortunate loss.